Hello, everybody. My name's Jim, and this is a spoiler-free review of Christine by Stephen King. And based on the way that this book is laid out, you could probably flip those names and say that this is Stephen King written by Christine. I think it's funny that once you get to a point in your author career where you are as popular and well-respected as Stephen King, doesn't matter what's on the cover or what the title is, as long as your name is on the book, it's gonna sell. But yeah, so I wanted to talk about this book. I know that it's not the most popular one of Stephen King's novels, but it is the first one that I read, and I will say that I read this with nostalgia glasses. I used to watch the movie Christine as a kid whenever it came on TV because my parents would not allow me to rent this out on my own, so I had to watch it on TV. But yeah, I wanted to review this because I loved cars when I was little. I used to play with toy cars, so of course I had an attachment to Christine, even though it was a horror movie and she was a little out of hand, out of control. The first thing I wanted to talk about is the movie differences between the movie and the book. If you've only seen the movie and you haven't read the book because you're worried that it would be too comparative, there would be too much of the same thing, I wouldn't worry too much about it because when I read the book, I was shocked. The scene on the cover of the book that I have, the paperback version, the one that's on your screen, that was the scene that I was looking forward to most in the book because it is etched in my memory from the movie. So when I got to that scene, I was floored. It was crazy how much that scene was different and how impactful it was in the book compared to the movie. A fun fact is that the movie was actually created using the original manuscript that Stephen King provided the director, so it wasn't even the final copy of the book. So maybe things were changed and edited in the book after the movie was created before it was published, or Stephen King could have provided a manuscript that was just as intense as the book was, but in order to keep it at a certain rating, the director opted out of making some of the scenes as violent as they are in the book. I don't know, but they were certainly more impactful in the book, and they felt different enough to where it really was like I was experiencing the scene in a completely different way. So I'm thrilled to have read the book. I am happy that this was my first venture into Stephen King territory because, like I said, I know that this book is very underread and people don't really have it high up on their list in terms of Stephen King novels. So I'm glad that I was able to do this just for the nostalgia factor so that I could have that first experience be something that I enjoyed from the movie that I could take into the book and enjoy it there as well. The point of view of the novel Christine was from Dennis, who was this very standard run-of-the-mill jock type. He was very handsome. He was nice for the most part. He was kind of an average Joe. It sounds like it's a bad thing, but I preferred it to be from his perspective because he was surrounded by characters that carried the plot a lot more, like Arnie, especially Christine, who was a character in her own right, even though she was a car. I loved Dennis's parents, so it was okay to have his perspective be the main one. He protected Arnie, who was bullied all the time, but he didn't really show that same respect to some of the other characters in the novel, and that bothered me a little bit. I mean, every character is allowed to have their flaw or set of flaws, so that one was definitely his flaw, other than being pretty generic. But about midway through, we were relieved of Dennis for a brief period, and we were introduced to more characters and more points of view where we were able to see the world through other people's eyes. And it was a mix. It wasn't just, one character taking over for Dennis. It was a group of characters. And I feel like some of the characters were written in kind of to duct tape the plot because maybe Stephen King wasn't able to make the villains be relatable enough for us to really care what their perspectives were. So he kind of created some villains that were villains, but weren't as bad as the main ones that we were familiar with throughout the novel, because by that point we already despised them and really just didn't care. So that was a choice. You could definitely tell that some characters were just written in to fill in some of those gaps. But as far as the characters are concerned, there was so much time spent on Arnie, who was easy to forget wasn't the point of view character, just because he really was the main focus, as well as Christine, of course. But there was so much time spent harping on Arnie's personality change when he went out and purchased Christine. This is something that happened really early in the book and is also something that's mentioned in the blurb, so I'm not too scared about talking about it. I don't think that it was ever addressed in the book just how much Christine changed the personalities of everyone else in the novel, and you'll just have to read it to really see how everybody interacted with Christine, because it was different depending on the characters. But every single person in this novel had an opinion, and when it comes to obsession, sometimes they sounded a little bit hypocritical when they would go off on Arnie about how much time he was spending with her, washing her, taking care of her at the body shop that he worked at, because they were just as obsessed. They always had something to say. And yeah, I don't think that was addressed. I don't necessarily think that it needed to be, but it is something that when you go into this novel, just watch it yourself. Take note of how these characters are interacting with Christine and are talking about her and how it progresses over time, because it's something, again, that not a lot of people talk about. It's not something that's really addressed in the book, but it's something that I picked up on. Obviously, there are differences in the way that others interact with Christine compared to Arnie, so that is also something that I would personally note when you read this as well. It makes it a lot more interesting, a lot more psychological. So yeah, do that. But we need to talk about the star, and that is Christine. There is one thing that I want to talk about specifically with her, but first, another fun fact is that Christine was modeled after the Plymouth Fury. There weren't a lot of Plymouth Furies created, and I think that was Stephen King's goal, that he wanted to use a car, which is a beautiful car. He wanted to use a bit of a forgotten car, something that wasn't readily available and out there for the public. It made it a lot more mysterious, and I think that Christine overall really worked for the plot, just the type of car that she was. Stephen King did a ton of research for this novel, and I can tell everything he did, and probably everything that he does and has written, was deliberate. And that includes the car he chose and the music, which is one of the things that I thought was super cool about Christine, that she used to communicate with Arnie and her enemies. She would play these different songs depending on the situation to communicate how she was feeling at a certain time. And it just added to that ambiance, that creepy factor that Stephen King was going for. So what didn't necessarily work when everybody was harping on Arnie and his personality changes, in the beginning, we didn't really get to spend that much time with Arnie to really get an idea of who he was before he started becoming a bit obsessed over his new car. So because there was such a quick change between him just being this bullied high schooler to this obsessive teen, it felt a bit more commonplace. It wasn't that creepy when Stephen King would mention over and over and over again that Arnie wasn't the way he seemed. Because to me, that's how he was through most of the novel anyway, so it wasn't really creepy. But when it came to the music and how Christine communicated, there was this really cool juxtaposition between the surroundings and the atmosphere and the music that was playing. This was something that I thought was a bit stronger in the movie, just because I didn't have to Google any of the songs. I could just hear them. But in the book, there were some songs that I wasn't that familiar with, so I had to look them up just so I knew and could fully immerse myself in the experience. That is something that I think is so cool when you're able to mix sound and sight and create something that's just so tense and weird and awkward. That, to me, is creepy, and that worked for this novel. There were some other things that Stephen King did that I wasn't particularly a fan of. After one of the deaths, there was a map of the town all of a sudden. He just wrote it in. And I'm like, dude, read the room. I don't need this right now. Somebody was just murdered, and you're telling me where the closest BP station is. I don't care. Let me stay in that moment for a second. Let's transition a little bit more cleanly. Uh, so there were some odd choices that Stephen King made that made me bump this down to a 4-star rating. But otherwise, I love this novel. Again, I know it's not one of his favorites. I know it's underread, but I did enjoy it. And again, admittedly, it was read with nostalgia glasses on. So far, it is the longest book that I've read, and I read it within a week, which is something I don't often do, even for books that are less than 1/3 the size. So that tells you something. I was gripped, but of course it's Stephen King. So I am going to crack open more Stephen King books. I'm kind of looking at Cujo because I think Cujo was treated in the movie similarly to Christine. I think the manuscript was used and not the full novel, and that was another movie that I watched. So I do want to read that book as well and make a comparison between the movie and the book there as well. But yeah, otherwise, let me know what you think about Stephen King. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you like this video and want to support my channel. As always, the Goodreads link to Christine is in the description below. Click on that. If you want to purchase it, there is a drop down with different retailers that you can purchase this book from, or you can go to the library. I'm sure they have it in stock. Stop by your library, check it out, and read it for yourself if you haven't already. But otherwise, I've been Jim. You've been great. Happy reading.